Hello, this is Rajiv Talwar, and the purpose of this recording is to discuss purchasing units in Ariba. Our objectives will be to review the Ariba purchasing unit functionality to provide you enough information to decide whether purchasing units are appropriate for your implementation. Purchasing units are an Ariba construct that helps you to filter and segregate data in many different ways. In particular, we will start off discussing purchasing unit concepts. What is a purchasing unit and how does it work? As part of this, we will discuss the purchasing unit functionality and advantages, things like visibility control for your master data, as well as approval flow routing. It also allows you to control what comes back when you run a system search or report. And via purchasing units, we're also able to establish unique branding. However, there are quite a few limitations to purchasing units as well, and we will discuss those in detail. Following that, I'll take you through a slide intended to help you think further on whether purchasing units are appropriate for your implementation. In the end, if you do decide to go forward with purchasing units, we'll talk about the steps required to actually put those in place. So as far as purchasing unit concepts, let's start off by talking about what is a purchasing unit. A purchasing unit, which is sometimes also referred to as a procurement unit, is an Ariba-specific concept, and it is used to define a logical grouping for the filtering and segregation of data. Based on a purchasing unit that you've established, you can segregate the data and limit it to just people who have access to that particular purchasing unit. Most common examples of this: visibility of suppliers. You may have purchasing units based on a region or other logical breakdown, and you would only like the suppliers for that particular region to be visible. We can use purchasing units to accomplish that. Another example is the notification of group members on approval flow. We'll get into this in a little more detail, but approval flows can be segregated based on purchasing units. So even if a particular approval is required, it can go to different groups based on purchasing unit. Finally, searching visibility. We can control what data comes back from a system search and limit it based on the purchasing unit that a person belongs to. So there's a lot that we can accomplish with purchasing units, but please keep in mind it is an Ariba-specific concept. This is not something that would exist in your ERP system, but it is something that can be mapped in place. So for example, if your backend is SAP, a very common thing we see with customers is the purchasing unit is mapped to an associated company code or purchasing org. The following slide shows an example of a purchasing unit hierarchy. It is possible to have multiple levels within a purchasing unit, and this one shows you that at the highest level, we have a purchasing unit called All. And this is a geographic hierarchy, so underneath that we have the European region. That would be a separate purchasing unit, and that's broken down into Western Europe and Eastern Europe. Underneath each of those breakdowns, we have the particular countries. So in Western Europe, we can break it down into a purchasing unit for Germany, another one for France, and another one for Switzerland. Likewise, on the eastern side, for example, we could have the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary. So this is an example of how a purchasing unit hierarchy could be set up based on a geographic region. And keep in mind that all purchasing units at the top level is the parent of all the purchasing units underneath. If we decide to establish purchasing units, there's several master data files that would be affected. And one of the main things is we want to associate users with purchasing units. We can establish that type of relationship in two different ways. The first is to map users to the purchasing units they belong to using our file userconsolidated.csv. This is the main file that we use to load and establish users in Ariba. If we do this, this is a one-to-one relationship between users and purchasing units. And this mapping will determine a lot of the functionality the user will see going forward. It may determine what they see in searching and reporting. It also may determine if they submit a document, who does it route to for approval. That's the simplest way to do this. However, there is an option to use another file called responsibleuser.csv. And you may consider using this if users need to act on approvables for multiple purchasing units. In the responsible user file, we can tie a user to more than one purchasing unit. Now, this is primarily to affect approval flows, but it also affects the visibility of data in searching as well, and also in system reports in Ariba analysis. So responsible user can be leveraged, again, if we have users that are responsible for more than one purchasing unit. This slide shows the files in a little more detail. We can see that we can establish our users in our user consolidated file and tie groups to them in our group shared user map. So for example, for an existing user, George, he is tied to the tax manager group in the group shared user map file. Separately, we can establish our purchasing units in a file actually called procurementunit.csv. Again, the terms are interchangeable, but in procurementunit.csv, we actually will establish what our purchasing units are. So in this case, for example, we have an Acme 1 purchasing unit, and we have a separate logo for that purchasing unit. We can have unique branding in this manner, and we can establish what the parent purchasing unit is if we have a hierarchy, like we saw in the earlier slide. Once we have these two files set up, the responsible user file is an extension of the two. As I mentioned, if a user is responsible for more than one purchasing unit, this is where we can set that up. For example, you'll notice that the users listed here like Cynthia and Debbie are in here multiple times. And that's because based on these groups, they're responsible for more than one purchasing unit. You can have as many records as are needed in this file. So now let's get into the specific purchasing unit functionality. As I mentioned earlier, the prime purpose of purchasing units is to place constraints on your data. This can mean on your master data, in system searches. It can also mean in reporting. What data a user will be able to see in each of these areas will depend on the purchasing unit they're assigned to, or if they're in the responsible user file, which purchasing units, plural, they have access to. And remember, if we do have a hierarchy established, then depending on the type of data, users can see in their own purchasing unit, or potentially the purchasing unit they're responsible for, plus purchasing units that are either up or down in the hierarchy. So oftentimes customers do want to have access to multiple purchasing units, and it can be done in this manner. As I said before, purchasing unit it extends the responsible user concept in approval flows. We'll go through a slide on how that works, but basically based on the group that you're assigned to, it can route to different people based on purchasing units. The following is an example of how approval flows can be extended based on purchasing units. Here we have an item, a purchase requisition, submitted which requires approval from the purchasing agent group. The purchasing agent group currently has 6 members: Joe, Sally, Wilma, Jim, Sue, and Rob. If we extend this by establishing a purchasing unit, we can break it down into the 3 members that are in the purchasing unit for the East region and the 3 members of the purchasing agent group that are there for the West region. This way, if a requisition is created by a user who is in the West region, when it goes for purchasing agent approval, it is not going to go to all 6 members, but rather just to those 3 members that are responsible for the West region. So therefore, there will only be 3 notifications. And this is an example of how that approval is filtered based on the purchasing unit. We took a look at the responsible user file earlier, and here's an example of how such a segregation can be set up. For the purchasing manager group, as we said, we have 6 members in our example. All of their names are here. And the specific purchasing units they are responsible for are also established in a separate column. That way, if something comes for approval, it knows which person within the purchasing manager group to pull in. For example, you can see here that T. Woods is the responsible party for purchasing unit 1. If a user submits a requisition for purchasing unit 1, which requires purchasing manager approval, the system will look in this file for the purchasing manager group, who is responsible for PU number 1, and that's T. Woods. And you can see here's an example of how the lookup would occur. Based on that, the approval flow would put T. Woods as the responsible purchasing manager for this requisition. Users loaded in Ariba can be responsible for multiple purchasing units and multiple groups at the same time. There's no limit in this regard, and this screenshot shows an example of a user's profile, in this case Chad Knoll, who actually belongs to many different groups in the system. He's most likely a power user. In addition to the groups he belongs to, the system will also display for you which purchasing units he is limited to. So for example, for the invoice administrator group, he is only responsible for purchasing unit US 0012. However, for the expense administrator group, he is responsible for 6 different purchasing units. So any items coming for the expense administrator's approval for these 6 purchasing units would route to Chad Knoll. This slide shows an example of supplier segregation using purchasing units. Here we have 2 users, again one for the West purchasing unit and one for the East purchasing unit. The person in the West is able to see suppliers A, B, C, D, and E. This is based on our supplier master data and what purchasing units they're assigned to, as well as our user data. The person in purchasing unit East can also see suppliers D and E, but then they have only visibility to suppliers F, G, and H in addition. So if you look at this graphically, all the suppliers that the West person has access to are in this blue box. Again, suppliers A, B, C, D, and E are all within the blue box. The user in the East purchasing unit has access also to supplier D and E, as well as suppliers F, G, and H in the yellow box. There is a little bit of overlap between the two, and that's depicted in the green shaded area in the middle. But this is just an example of how for the various pieces of master data, such as suppliers, you can limit which users have access to which pieces of the data using purchasing units. The following is an example of how we can also limit searches based on purchasing units. We've seen this hierarchy in an earlier slide where we have a geographic purchasing unit for all, and then underneath that we have the European region. Europe is further broken down into the east part and the west part of the continent, and that's further broken down into the respective countries. This is an example of a purchasing unit hierarchy. If we have visibility control turned on, it will limit search results to items that belong to the purchasing units the user is responsible for, and also to any parent purchasing units. So what does this mean? For example, if we have this hierarchy in place for the invoice manager group in the system, an invoice manager that's responsible for Germany, France, and Switzerland, if they're set up for these 3 purchasing units in our responsible user file, they would also be able to see content for the purchasing unit of Western Europe. So as you can see in the graph, they would be able to see the 3 green purchasing units that they're assigned to, as well as the parent of these 3, which would be Western Europe. So we've seen up till this point quite a lot of advantages and capabilities of purchasing units, but there are quite a few limitations as well that I would like to make clear. First of all, purchasing units, while they can segregate data for the wide variety of our master data, there are 3 categories that are exceptions. First is units of measure. Units of measure tend to be standard across the different purchasing units. Ariba comes with a standard set of UN UOMs, that's United Nations Units of Measure, and those cannot be segregated. Secondly, the ERP commodity code map. That's a file that establishes the relationship between commodity codes and accounting. That cannot be segregated based on purchasing units, as well as the commodity codes themselves. Purchasing units, in addition, will not segregate some of the following configurations. And we talked about that they would segregate approval flow configuration. However, parameters, for example, which are global system settings that only Ariba personnel have access to, cannot be segregated based on purchasing units. Similarly, invoice exception types, that is, those items we police for on an incoming invoice, those discrepancies, those cannot be separated based on PU. Custom fields cannot be segregated. A custom field, when it is established, is for the entire instance of Ariba. Custom fields can potentially be limited based on user groups, but not on purchasing units. Default language and base currency, those cannot be segregated. A user has a user profile in Ariba where these 2 items are established, and that's where they're driven from. Separate data export events routed to a specific ERP. So there's quite a few different data export events or batch processes that Ariba comes with. Those cannot be segregated. And the user interface branding and print layouts cannot be segregated. Now let me be specific on this. The user interface branding is the logo you would see in the upper left corner of the user interface. That cannot be segregated. Most of the print layout, also in the print view, cannot be segregated, with the exception of logos on purchase orders. The PO print view can have different logos based on purchasing unit. Continuing on with limitations, data objects with no purchasing units by default are shared between all purchasing units. So if the data object is not limited based on PU, all PUs would have access to it. If you are a power user that has query all permissions, that is the ability to see enterprise-wide data. Even with those permissions, that is narrowed down based on purchasing unit if we have the visibility control feature enabled. So again, normally somebody with query all permission can see across the enterprise, but if we have purchasing units in place and visibility control turned on, which is turned on via a parameter, that's much more restrictive and limits what you can see based on PU. Next category is administrative notifications. So unlike approval request notifications, which we've seen can be limited based on purchasing units, administrative notifications cannot be. These are all the standard notifications that the system would send out for administrative related tasks based on the batch processes that run behind the scenes and other tasks. Those are standard and cannot be filtered. For further information on this, we do have a standard notifications guide that you can refer to. Finally, I touched upon this earlier, but data exports. Transactional data exports that do not include purchasing unit filtering, but may include purchasing unit as a column. So if we would like to send purchasing units across to our ERP system, we can include the purchasing units in those exports. However, we cannot limit what data appears in the export based on the PU. So it's only sent for informational purposes to your ERP system. Finally, earlier we did touch upon supplier filtering, and we saw an example of how suppliers can be limited based on PU. But there is no supplier filtering for a few cases. First of all, if we are using purchasing cards in our implementation. Purchasing cards are an optional feature, and normally they are tied to a supplier location. It is also possible to have individual purchasing cards, but when we're tying one to a supplier location, which is called a ghost P card, we cannot filter based on PU. If you are a supplier manager or system administrator and you're working on the administrative side in the supplier manager workspace in particular, data there is not limited. If you are an administrator, you need to have access to all of the data. Finally, our receiving types. It is possible in Ariba to set up receiving types based on commodity code or part number. If we are setting up a receiving type based on a supplier part number, on the administrative side, again, that cannot be limited based on purchasing units. So now that we have an idea of everything purchasing units affect, let's go through some examples of how they would affect the different pieces of functionality to really drive home the idea of the difference that happens in functionality when purchasing units are implemented. For example, with searches. If you do not have purchasing units set up, by default, a user can search and run reports on items that belong to them, their own transactions, and those of their subordinates, anybody who report to them. If you belong to the purchasing agent group, you can view all approvables. So for example, you can view all requisitions. Again, without purchasing units, those are the standard limitations to visibility. A standard end user can only see their own items and those of their subordinates. A purchasing agent can see across the enterprise. However, if you do have purchasing units over here on the green side, here we're limiting things considerably. First of all, a user can search for their own items, that doesn't change, but they can only search for their subordinate items only if that item belongs to their own purchasing unit or another purchasing unit they're responsible for. Remember, we saw the responsible user file where those responsibilities are set up. So you are limited in that fashion based on PU. Even if you belong to the purchasing agent group, again, you can only view items that belong to your purchasing unit or those purchasing units that you're responsible for. So you no longer have access to enterprise-wide data. You're limited based on PU. As far as approval flows, we saw an example of this earlier. If we have an approval group in place, and that is put onto an approval flow for an item, when the notifications go out, it will go out to the entire group. So for example, if purchasing agent is on the approval flow and my requisition needs purchasing agent approval, all members of that group will receive a notification to take action. However, over here on the green side, if we do have purchasing units in place, which users within that group receive notifications for approval will depend on the purchasing units they're responsible for. So it will limit who receives the notifications. It will not go to the entire group, but only to those members responsible for that particular purchasing unit. Reporting. Reporting works very similar to searching. By default, without purchasing units, you can run a report on your own items and those of your subordinates. If we have purchasing units established, just like with searching, you can only run reports if the item belongs to your own purchasing unit. Regarding your subordinates items, you can only run reports for those if they belong to purchasing units you are responsible for. So again, you're limited in the same way as with searching. With regards to suppliers, we saw an example of this earlier. Without purchasing units, a user can see all suppliers across the board. Within an SAP environment, that's based on a purchasing org, but otherwise you can pretty much see enterprise-wide all the vendors. So if you're doing a requisition, you can choose any vendor that's available. However, if you have purchasing units established, suppliers will be filtered based on the purchasing unit you're assigned to. So if I belong to purchasing unit 1, I am only able to see suppliers that also belong to purchasing unit 1. If you're an SAP backend, the filtering is done based on the purchasing organization and the purchasing unit. So it is a combination in that case. It takes it one step further. Finally, with respect to users, if purchasing units are not in place, users are not filtered. If I am doing an on behalf of requisition and I go into the on behalf of user search, I will see everybody loaded in Ariba. If I do have purchasing units established and I belong to purchasing unit 1, when I go into the user search, I will only see other users within purchasing unit 1. I will not see other purchasing unit based users. So now let's talk about requirements gathering. You've heard a lot of information about purchasing units up to this point. How do you know if they're really right for your implementation? The following slide is intended to give you some food for thought regarding whether you want to use purchasing units. In order to make this decision, we need to think about, is there a need to limit our choosers, first of all? A chooser is another name for a search within Ariba, a master data search. So for example, if I'm doing an on behalf of in my requisition, on behalf of another person, I can go into the user, the on behalf of dropdown, and search for a user to do my transaction on behalf of. That type of a search is also called a chooser. So we may want to consider using purchasing units if there's a need to filter the list of suppliers or supplier locations and potentially their catalogs if necessary, based on a grouping. Very often this is regional in nature. For example, I may have one group of suppliers for North America and a separate group of suppliers for Europe. Do I have a need to filter my user list? As I mentioned, the key example is the on behalf of. Should I have access to choose any user to do a transaction on behalf of, or do I want to limit that based on PU? Finally, do I want to filter my accounting? This is a very common requirement with customers. They want to make sure that region-specific accounting is only available to that region. It does not make sense for it to be available to other regions, oftentimes. Second thing to consider, is there a need to segregate my approval flow? We saw an example earlier of how when you have an approval group, if something routes to that group for approval, every member will get notified and any one of them can take action. But maybe we need to be more specific and segregate that group based on purchasing unit. If we have that need to route those items and therefore the notifications, the approval notifications, based on a subgroup within our approval group, then we may want to consider using purchasing units. system searching, and some of the operational aspects, we may want to consider using purchasing units if there's a need to restrict users from seeing data for other purchasing units. Like we said before, things like searching on approvables. Approvables is any item that requires approval. It could be a requisition, it could be a receipt, it could be an invoice, etc. It could even be a contract. Do we have a need to restrict users from seeing other data within reports? So again, if I belong to the North America purchasing unit and I'm running a system report, do I really need to see data that pertains to Europe or South America? Maybe not. So there are a lot of considerations with respect to searching and reporting that we should consider when we're deciding whether to implement purchasing units. Next is our user assignments. Now this is a key area. Are there any scenarios where a user would not be easy to place in a single purchasing unit, whether that as a requisitioner or as an approver? We need to think about that, and if we do establish purchasing units, would it be a one-to-one relationship between user and purchasing unit, or might we need that responsible user file to make a user responsible for more than one purchasing unit? Another thing to consider is on the invoice side, as far as who can key in invoices directly in Ariba and who is responsible for reconciliation. Do we have an expectation that if it is a manual invoice, that's an invoice for a supplier not enabled in Ariba, most likely an invoice that they've emailed us or faxed us, would they be entered by a central accounts payable group? If not, if our accounts payable function is fragmented or segmented, we may want to consider using purchasing units. That way, different people in the different accounts payable groups would be responsible for keying in different types of invoices. Likewise, for invoice reconciliation, if it is a central function, we may not need purchasing units. If it is not a central function, it may be something to consider to make sure that the appropriate people are doing the appropriate reconciliations. So a lot of food for thought there. As far as next steps, based on the information presented, hopefully you have enough to go on to decide whether purchasing units are needed for your implementation of Ariba. Again, they are an optional feature. What I would like to add here is that if you do not add purchasing units now and realize later on in your implementation you need them, they can be added. However, it is very complex. It will require many updates to your configuration. You'll need to establish the purchasing unit file, the responsible user file. You may need to alter approval flows. And the last thing you will need to do is update your master data to assign it to specific purchasing units. So if you decide to go forward with purchasing units in your Ariba implementation, let's look at these steps in a little more detail. To set up purchasing units, the first thing is to consider visibility control. Visibility control is established via a parameter. Again, that is a global system setting that only Ariba personnel have access to, and that restricts what you can see when you're running searches, reports, and looking through master data. The second step would be to map purchasing units to the appropriate corresponding entity from your ERP system. Very commonly, we see purchasing units mapped to company codes, sometimes to business units, and things of that nature. There is usually a one-to-one relationship between these types of elements. The third step would be to actually establish your purchasing units. We saw earlier there is a file called procurementunit.csv, and that's where we actually define and establish RPUs. Once we have those in place, in the user CSV file, we can assign purchasing units to specific users. In step 5, if a user is responsible for more than one purchasing unit, That's where the responsible user.csv file comes into play. You can go into this file and assign users to the groups they're responsible for and to the purchasing units. Step 6, you're going to want to map data to purchasing units for data segmentation through each respective CSV file. So this is what I mentioned at the end of the previous slide. For each set of master data that you want to assign to a purchasing unit, you will add that column to the file. Finally, for requisitions, you can associate the group and requisition limits with either purchasing units or through requisitionlimit.csv. So if there are purchasing unit specific limits, that file can be used to establish that. And similarly, on the receiving side, if you have different tolerances for receiving based on purchasing units, that's also possible. And we configure that through a file called receiving tolerances by pu.csv. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of configuration if purchasing units are in scope, and that's why it's better to make that decision up front, and if you decide to implement them, to do so right away. It can be done later on in a project, but then it is a potential danger or risk to your timeline. Thank you for listening to this recording on purchasing units. Hopefully now you have the information you need to decide whether purchasing units make sense for your implementation of Ariba.